Welcome to my third video where we're making asteroids in GameMaker. And judging from this image you can tell that I have up here, the focus for this video is adding a background and then also adding a few extra effects for my ship engine so that the player gets some visual feedback that they're actually moving the ship. So some little particles to come out the back. So let's start with the particles first because I think it would be good to see those against a black background before we actually choose a background, just so we can kind of play around with that. So to do the particles, I'm going to need to import in a new set of sprites. So I want kind of basically just something about the size of a pixel. The image that I made is like a 3x3 little plus sign, essentially. So let's go and import that in. But what's going to be interesting about this is going to import in as an animation rather than a static image. So, but the process is mostly the same. So we right click on sprites and we go to create sprite. I'm going to call this SPR underscore engine sparks, or maybe engine spark singular. And then when I go to import, so inside of the assets here, if we go to the effects category, I have 5 engine sparks. Now it's really hard to see because they're white, but we want to load these in. So I'm going to hold down single left click first on engine spark 5. Then I'm going to hold down shift, and then I'm going to single left click on engine spark 1. And you can see that it group selected all 5 of these to import. You could also draw a box around them, but be careful to make sure to only draw the box around the ones you want. So like I can draw my box around these 5 and then hit open. And when I do that, GameMaker is going to import them in as a animation. So importing these is not undoable, you hit yes. And so you can see that I've got each frame of the spark right here. Now this is where we're going to want to play around with this FPS setting because that's going to control how fast this animates, how many frames per second this is going to try to do. And this is going to be really fast at 30. So it's basically going to go that quick. I'm going to go for like 12. So it'll look like that. And I'm going to turn off loop. So the idea is that I only see, like, this is what it's going to do when it comes out of the ship. And then it's going to disappear after that. So you can play around with the FPS to get a setting you want. I'm going to go with 12 and we might tweak it from there. I am going to also make sure the origin is back into the center. Now, because this is such a small number of pixels, I don't have a lot of options for where the center is going to be best at. And actually, you can kind of see from here that this may even work better for an even sized graphic. This is a 5x5 image, so the center happens to be the upper left of here. When I kind of wanted it there, so this we'll play with this over time. The collision mask is not going to matter because these are not going to collide with anything. All right, so we're going to close that, and now we're going to make the object for this spark. So I'm going to right click and create a new object. And I'm going to call this obj underscore engine spark. And I'm going to choose to give it that sprite. Now, to save me some effort, there's a really useful event here called, it's under the other, called animation end. So when the animation finishes playing, this event will fire. And I only want it to play the animation once, so what I could do here is just delete it whenever that animation is finished. So I can just say instance underscore destroy, and that will destroy this object when the animation is complete. Now, if you want to fix this, if you notice it's always opening with those 7 lines, that's under Preferences, Object Editor. And then you can see here, this is like the default thing to insert. So if you wanted to change that, like you can see I've got like a billion lines there, so I don't want that many lines. I'm just gonna hit OK on that. So in the future, it won't open with 7 lines of blank here. All right, so this spark is done. I'm gonna leave it white because I can tint it via code when the ship spawns these. So I can get a little bit creative with how I colorize these. All right, so let's jump over to the player. And when we're pressing up, this is where we're going to want to spawn these sparks, because if we're pressing up, we want the ship to kind of give some kind of visual indicator that it's doing something. So right underneath where we cap the speed, I'm just adding some comments here. So right after we cap the speed, we want to spawn sparks for the engine. So if we want to have a multiple number of sparks, we can do a variable here like num sparks. And I'm just going to leave it at 2 so that we can at least see how we could change this. Let's use a for loop. And the for loop behaves much like it does in Java or C. Except for instead of saying int I, we would say var I, while I is less than num sparks, I++. So it's basically the same for loop. Just we say var instead of int. Now we want to spawn a spark. So the command to spawn a spark is, well, let's start with the command to spawn it. Instance underscore create underscore. Now there's 2 different ways to create a new thing. You can either create it using the depth command or the layer command. The depth command would allow you to set the height, so like the stacking order of how things would draw. But I'm just going to use layer. I mostly use layer. The first command is the X position to spawn, which would be the center of the ship. The Y position to spawn. Which layer to spawn on. If you use the keyword layer, that's going to refer to the current layer. And then the last parameter is which object to spawn, which is obj engine spark. Now, that is the command to spawn something. And we can watch this, and this is going to spawn 2 of them because this for loop's going to run twice. But right now, they're not really kind of coming out with any force. They're just going to appear where the ship is. So we can play test that and see what that looks like. So when I drive, it just kind of leaves a trail like behind. And they are tiny, so I feel like I should scale that up a little bit. So let's scale it up, and that's going to be an interesting thing to do. So let's go to sprites, double-click the SPR for the engine spark. Now, if I click on this little 4-arrow icon, I can resize it. And I do want to just double its size, so I'm just going to change the width to 10. And because I have maintained aspect ratio, when I click out of here, you can see that it's going to also update the height so that it doesn't disproportionately scale it. Then I can click apply. And now my middle center is a lot happier, and it's just a bigger spark. So I'm going to close that. We'll hit play test again, and now the sparks will appear a little bit bigger. And you can adjust the speed it animates at if you feel like those are too fast. But we want to add a little bit more effects to it. Like I want to have some color to these sparks and give some random settings to them. So that means we're going to have to modify this command when I spawn it. Because if I want to change the properties of the spark that I just created, I need to have a reference to that object. So I'm going to say var spark equals. And now this object that I just instantiated is going to be stored in this variable here called spark. And so now I would be able to access properties of this thing I just spawned. So let's give it a direction. So we can say spark.direction. I know, like in AP Computer Science, we kind of avoided directly accessing variables like this, but this is kind of the norm for GameMaker. So spark.direction equals direction plus 180. And so that's going to make it aim opposite the direction the ship is traveling. And let's give it a little bit of jitter. Random underscore range from -20 to +20. So what that'll do is this will generate a random floating point number in between -20 and +20. So it'll give it kind of a little bit of an arc that it could kind of spawn from. If I'm going to pull up my favorite tool here, the idea is that when my ship is moving, so like here's my ship, when I'm spawning a spark, I want it to kind of go out this direction of my ship, but I also want to kind of create a little cone. So we basically have, that's going to be 20 degrees, and that's going to be 20 degrees. So we're basically creating a 40-degree arc that these particles are going to come out the back of the ship in. Otherwise, they'd all come out completely straight on the back, and that doesn't look as cool. So each spark will get a random direction, and then let's give it a little bit of a speed. We could just pick one, or why not continue randomizing? So random underscore range, 1,1.8. So it is worth pointing out that random underscore range generates a floating point number. If you wanted a integer, you could just say irandom, and it would generate an integer as a result. It would be very mad about that. So now with this, my particles are going to come out with some kind of angle to the back. So you can see that they're a little bit more chaotic coming out of the back of the ship, which is more what I wanted. So if you wanted to increase the the angle that they spawn in, you could do that to make it a little bit more interesting. So like you could increase this a little bit. And so the particles, you can see, are going to create a bigger trail from behind the ship. And so the last thing I want to do with the particles is give them some color. So this is where you can have a little bit of fun, assuming color equates to fun. And so we're going to use the image blend command. Image blend tints the sprite. And so that's why I left the original sprite white. And that's actually a very useful thing to be able to do. Is like you have like a white sprite and then you just tint it the color you need it to be. So image blend, we can then pick the color. So there's two different ways you could do this. You could specify a specific color using the built-in colors. So like if I wanted blue, I could just say spark.imageBlend equals C blue, and that will use a specific built-in shade of blue in GameMaker. And so there's a couple different ones. You could look through that list. The other way is to define the color ourselves. So let's add some comments here. So if we want to set the color ourselves, there's two different commands to do that with. The first one is make color. Well, if I start typing make color, the autocomplete pulls them up. There's RGB and HSV. So if we know the exact red, green, blue values, now there is a little bit of a question as to which colors is it going to use. So if you pull up the manual, we can actually look at the definition of this make color RGB command. And you can see that it's using out of 255. So if I wanted to have different colors, it would be on a scale of 255. So if I know specifically which color I want, then I could use that. So for instance, if I pull up an image editing program, such as GIMP, I don't have Photoshop, so like if I wanted a specific shade of blue, I can look at the red, green, blue values of the color picker here and see what color. Now, keep in mind what scale we're looking at, because right now GIMP is showing from a scale from 0 to 100, but you can switch it to 0 to 255. So if I wanted this shade of teal for my engine, I could see that it's 0 red, 220 green, and 255 blue. So I could program that in here. And so this will make a teal color. So now as I fly, I have a little teal effects. Now the last one is a little bit more fun for randomness, and that's to use the HSV settings. And this is another spectrum of color that's a hue, saturation, and value. So as opposed to the other approach, which is red, green, blue, so where we're defining a certain amount of red, green, and blue, we could use a certain hue, a certain saturation, and a certain value. Now, what's kind of annoying about how GameMaker does this is most everything when it processes hue, because the color wheel, the name color wheel, because it's a wheel, typically hue is expressed. So like if I look at this in terms of hue, saturation, and value, hue tends to be expressed out of 360 degrees because it's a circle. But GameMaker wants it out of 255, which is mildly more annoying because I couldn't put in 190 for the hue here and expect it to work because it's on a 0 to 255 scale where this value is from that. So we would have to do a little bit of math to compute that. So let's say I want to have, like I want to pick kind of like here, and then I'm going to randomly pick out of a range around it. So this would be a hue of 215. And that is on a scale factor of 360. So if I divide it by 360, that turns it into a value from 0 to 1. And then we could just re-expand it back to 255. So we could pull up a calculator here if I type in calc correctly. So if I want this on a scale of 255, I could just do that divided by 360 multiplied by 255. And so I'll round it to like 152. So 152 should be this kind of pale blue color, not exactly teal. And then I can add some randomness to be able to grab up to this shade of teal. So that's like 180. So let's see what maximum randomness I would need there. So that end would be up to 131. So essentially my low value is I want 131. My mid value, I want that. So I guess my high value would be, so it looks like it's this plus or minus 21. So let's go use that other command. Spark.imageBlend equals make color HSV. So the first color that, the hue that I had was 152. So we're going to use that. And we want the full level of saturation and a full level of brightness. So this will be that kind of palish blue. You can kind of see I'm getting that pale blue. So, like I said, I wanted to randomize it some. So, let's take that number and then add some amount of randomness to it. And my computations gave me 21. So if I do this, I'll have a little bit of random to my hue. So as I generate the sparks, it's going to give me a band of about 42 degrees. Well, I guess it's not degrees, 42 plus or around this value. So I'll get teals and dark blues as a result. So you can kind of see I'm getting some teals, I'm getting some dark blues. I could lower that randomness value to get fewer variations of color. But hue is a pretty fun way to play with kind of randomization of color. So like if I dropped this maybe to like 16 or so. Then I should have less variation. I may not even get that bright teal anymore. Let's look at some of that teal. And so now I'm getting these kind of cool particle effects coming out of the back of the ship. And you can play with those values. You can pull up any sort of web tool to help pick hues and play around with that. But I think that's a really kind of fun way to add some color to your project. So the last part, this is all we're going to really do with the sparks. If you want more sparks, increase that number, play with these values a little bit. The last part is to just add a background. Backgrounds are pretty simple. So under sprites, we're going to go and create a new sprite. Backgrounds are sprites. I'm still going to call it SPR. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not I should just call it BG for background, because it's not meant to be a sprite. So I might just call it BG. We'll call it space 1. And then we'll go to import. And I have a few backgrounds here. Not the most exciting. Now, the biggest hurdle that we're going to run into is getting it to match the level size. So let me pick one that I know is not going to match. So I'm going to pick nebula clouds. And because it's a background, I don't need to really play with the origin. So I'm going to leave it like this. And notice that it's a 124 by 124. So kind of big. If I jump over to my room, and then I select the background layer, this is where I can choose the sprite for the background. So I pick BG space, and we run into our first problem of it doesn't fit the whole stage. So if I hit play, it's going to look really bad. So we've got part of a background there, and no background. Ooh, I even get like a cool hollow mirrors effect. That's pretty cool. That's actually really cool looking. So yeah, it's kind of like not drawing the black because it's trying to draw that sprite and it doesn't exist. So obviously we don't want that. So we could try to stretch it, which may, depending on your image, may look bad, but this does, I mean, the stars will look elongated. You can try to tile it. This is not a tileable background. So you can see that the tiling is not lining up there. The other option would just be to resize the room to fit the background. So we could go to room and change these values. But I kind of liked the room being a 16 by 9 resolution. Because believe it or not, despite the weird numbers that they picked here, this is actually a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So maybe I want to scale my room up to be a length of 1600 and 900. But even if I do that, it's not going to solve the problem. You know, it just doesn't look right. So choosing a background is going to be a delicate task, and there isn't a right answer. You could load this up in like Photoshop, GIMP, or your preferred web tools, Paint.net, and try to rescale it. You could pick a different background that might fit better. So let me try some of these other space ones, which I don't think are 16:9 resolution. So like this isn't going to fit correctly. If I scale it, so if I choose to stretch it, it might work. And so that's what the game would look like now. You can kind of tell it was stretched up because there's a little bit of like pixelation and smudging going on with it. So I might want to pick a more subtle background. And you'll want to load up a couple backgrounds because we are going to design this game to have different stages. So when you clear one level, we're going to load the next level. So I would encourage you to try to load a couple different backgrounds in. And so you might want to, inside your sprites folder here, create a group called backgrounds and move your backgrounds into there. So I'll play around with my backgrounds off the camera. It might take me a while to settle on some that I like. But I would encourage you to make at least, to get about 3 or so backgrounds so that the player knows the stage changed. So when we load the next level to have a new star background. But that should wrap this up. So we have a background. We can change the size of the level as needed. I will say, we're not going to explore, like if we, so to get back there, you have to single left click over here. We aren't going to explore viewports and cameras. That would allow us to have like a scrolling screen or adjust the size of the render window. Asteroids just screen wraps. We don't really have a camera track anything, so I'm not going to play around with that. But in future projects, we would. So we're not going to play around with the viewports or the room physics. We're just going to kind of stick to picking a size here and then just going with that. So pick a size. You'll probably want to make sure that any future levels we create will have the same size. We'll re-explore that much later once we're done adding asteroids and weapons and start getting into multiple stages. But for now, pick out some backgrounds. Play around with the colors for your ship. So we've got some engine particles, we've got a background. And then the next video that I'll do will clean up some of the controls so that we can have less events. I'm going to move the events over into the step action. And then after that, we'll start actually adding some weapons. So thank you for watching and hope you learned something.